So hello, greetings to you. It's Thomas Daffern here again for my Sunday broadcast. Essentially, it's turning into a bit of a ritual. As you know, I've been fasting every Sunday for to stop Brexit, basically, and register my voice as a protest against it. I regard it as a serious problem, and that's why I flagged it up, based on my research and studies into the matter. Today is the 25th of August, and we celebrate the death of two important European intellectuals who were very different in their outlooks. Firstly, it's the day on which Nietzsche died in the year 1900. Nietzsche was, a great and courageous thinker. I don't agree with all his, findings, but I do agree that he shook up the European bourgeois intellectuals of his day and insisted that they focus on absolute truth and stop sort of sheltering behind a kind of comfortable Christianity. As a classical scholar, he'd studied ancient Greek thought. He was aware of this split in European consciousness between Dionysus and Apollo, between rationality and unreason. And he paid the price for it because, it was difficult for him to constellate his own fertile intellectual work into a whole. He didn't have much backup. He found the scholarship of his day very shallow, and people were interested in careers, not in truth. I have to say I found exactly the same when I studied philosophy at the University of Bristol in the 1970s. I found these philosophers not real philosophers at all. They were triviality, salesmen. They were churning out little essays about whether the "the" should be before or after the verb and what that meant, Unbelievable triviality. And I did a Nietzsche. I left and walked to Stonehenge one beautiful May morning around the time of my birthday. I think it was 75. I resigned from the university, which was just pumping out this. It was like a dumbing down of our capacity to think as human beings. And if you want to study philosophy, you should be asking the really profound, deep questions. And I was told you can't ask those questions because clever people like A.J. Ayer and Wittgenstein have said they're meaningless. Like what is God? Is there a soul? Do we survive death? All these big metaphysical questions that one wants to ask if you're studying philosophy. No, can't even ask them, let alone answer them. So, bless him, Saint Nietzsche died today. We honour him. He's also been inspiring one of my colleagues here in Europe, Rob Reimann, who's a great contemporary Dutch intellectual. Philosophy, set up a thing called the Nexus Institute. He's like a kind of Dutch version of me, in fact. He's written a very important book against the spirit of this age, which is an exposure of contemporary neo-fascism, really, and where it comes from. And he rightly says it's all about revenge thinking, about resentment. And he's got a very subtle psychological analysis of the right-wing resurgence in parts of British and European intellectual life in America. And the narrative is constantly, we were wronged, we want revenge, we're going to attack the system. It was exactly the same thought world that gave rise to Mussolini and to Hitlerism in the 30s and 20s, which is why we're living in such a dangerous time. But it's interesting that Riemann is at pains to point out that these right-wingers hijacked Nietzsche for their own cause. In fact, as he makes plain, Nietzsche was a cosmopolitan. He was a pan-European. He looked forward. He said as much in his writings to a pan-European cosmopolitan society, just as Kant had done. And it was Rob who revealed to me the importance of Sils Maria, a little village in Switzerland, where Nietzsche used to rent a house or a room in a house and spend most of his summer holidays writing. I hadn't realised, I've always known the importance of place to philosophy. The great mystery centres of Europe, like Eleusis, where I've been outside Athens, or Samothraki, or Cumae, south of Naples, where the Italian mysteries were performed. These mystery centres, like Avebury in Britain and things, place is very important. And Nietzsche's philosophy was shaped partly by his loving of Switzerland, which he said gave him this clarity of thought, this clarity of air, to do his critique of then European intellectual life. And one of the things he was so against was nationalism. He wanted cosmic truth. Now that's not nationalism. That's a bastardized form of it. Nationalism is simply like eulogizing the place you're born in. Well, everyone's born somewhere. We should be eulogizing the whole planet in which we're all born. Whether we're born into whatever colour skin or type of body is irrelevant. We're all souls in descent. We're all avatars in incarnation. And the point of philosophy is to remind us of that, so that we come back to our best, brightest selves. We're reborn, to use Christian language, in the Holy Spirit and in the light of God, and we remember who we were before we were born. So anyway, I salute Nietzsche, and he's been a great inspiration for me when I was a teenager wanting to grow up and become a philosopher. He inspired me. Growing up in Brighton, talking to University of Sussex students about Nietzsche, it was like a revelation to me. Gosh, people could have that much integrity. And but unfortunately it spoiled conventional academia for me, until I discovered there were actually pockets in academia that have equal integrity. Then I also want to salute today the death of Hume. Incredibly, he died on the same day as Nietzsche. They're so very different, but they're both great intellectuals. Hume, again, was Scottish, but a very European-wide thinker. He was one of the Enlightenment figures from Britain, along with Adam Smith and others, and Gibbon and so on, that contributed to this European-wide phenomenon called the Enlightenment. Now, Hume was a skeptic, but he was a skeptic in the best sense of the word. He suspended judgment. He practiced epoche. It's not like he didn't believe in X, Y, Z. He just suspended judgment till he saw sufficient proof. And his critique of miracles, his critique of conventional Christianity and so on, is still a powerful intellectual achievement, which is studied at A-level, etc. But on a positive front, what Hume believed in was scholarship. He believed in learning, in reason, in study, in research. And so do I, He died reading the works of a great Syrian intellectual called Lucian, who was a satirist and humorist and a profound thinker in his own right, who wrote a very amazing book about going on pilgrimage to a temple of the goddess in Syria, where Atargatis was worshipped. And not many people realise, but this goddess, who was very important, symbolised by a fish, was the goddess who was worshipped in the Galilee region. And this temple where Lucian went was not too far from Galilee. Almost certainly at the time of Christ there were people worshipping Atargatis, the fish goddess, who stood for fertility and love and all the things we all love. And Lucian writes a pilgrimage going to this goddess, which is a very important pagan text. He also wrote about Druids, and he'd heard of Druids, and he heard of Christians. He gave them a certain critical write-up. He found them somewhat, exaggerated in their claims. And Hume loved this guy and was reading him when he died. So this day, we look back on Hume dying reading Lucian, who was, another pan-European Hellenistic intellectual who happened to be Syrian. These are cosmopolitan thinkers, people like Nietzsche and Hume and Lucian. And I salute them all. I'm working in that lineage as a humble little, spear carrier to the cohorts of wisdom that have gone before. And I seem to be the one on the job now that's speaking out against this travesty called Brexit, which is the product of the dumbed down civilization that we used to call British civilization. At its best, it is cosmopolitan and global in its outlook and internationalist, a word that was coined by Jeremy Bentham, a great London-based intellectual who used to, who was a founder of utilitarian ethics. So anyway, let's salute all these people, and the culture at Sils Maria in Switzerland is fascinating if you look up Rob Riemann's work on it, because not only did Nietzsche go there, but also Proust, Rilke, many of the great intellectuals of Europe of the day would go there for part of their summer holidays and meet. it's that cosmopolitan society that I think is what's best about European civilization, of which Britain is an honourable and important member. Let's keep it together. And the European Union is a wonderful attempt to like integrate our difference within a unity, which is why the symbol of the flag, the stars against a blue background, symbolise that unity and diversity in one, which was the point of Plato's teaching, another great European intellectual from the past, who founded the first academy. Yes, the one and the many exist in this dialectic of love, fundamentally. Okay, so I want to move on now and address something that's tragic going on as we speak, which is the forest fires raging in Brazil, and also in Siberia, and also in Indonesia. The planet is on fire. And from a perspective of eco-ethics, this is a planetary emergency, and it transcends nation borders. I think the European Union, including the UK, should send a kind of naval fleet to help put out these fires in Brazil if they're that bad. I know that the president of Brazil has now ordered the Brazilian army to help, but it's he was very slow on the uptake, and we should have a sort of force ready to go for environmental disasters. When I was in Moscow in 1990, elected coordinator of Philosophers of Peace, Gorbachev was still the president of the country, and he then later stepped down, and he set up a thing called the Green Cross, which I greatly admired. I knew people that knew Gorbachev at that time. I met some learned professors who knew him. I think Gorbachev was a great intellectual, and he realised that the world is facing huge environmental problems. That was what motivated him into ending the Cold War with the USA. He acted in good faith. He signed a long-range nuclear control treaty with Reagan and Thatcher, and that brought the Cold War to the end. I don't think the Americans, particularly the USA, actually signed the Treaty of Paris in 1990 in good faith. I think they thought, we've outwitted these pesky Russians. We're going to kind of destroy their USSR and infiltrate and bring nations to rise up, and meanwhile we'll sort of put bases all around them. If that was what was done, and it looks historically as if that's the case, then it's shocking. And Putin obviously has sort of decided to reverse that. And I think that the West has to do some serious moral reflection, because Gorbachev was a planetary-wide thinker who set up the Green Cross to be the kind of the support team of last resort for eco-emergencies. He'd lived through Chernobyl. He knew what a catastrophe this was. He wasn't prepared to unleash a nuclear war on the planet. So he said, no, let's disarm. Let's have a kind of agreement. And that, unfortunately, disgracefully, the Americans have now reneged on that. They should go back immediately. I mean, they've got to get rid of Trump. This man is a complete nightmare in the hands of the corporate capitalist elite who have no conscience. They seem to have no soul at all. He just wants to make America great, big, strong, and malevolent again. Sorry, it's not good enough. We have that won't put out the forest fires that are raging. So we need a kind of standby Green Cross type thing, and that can go and respond to these emergencies. When I worked at the University of London, we had a brigadier general from the Indian Army come and give a talk. A general who was in charge of what's called the eco battalions of the Indian Army. Fantastic idea. The Indian Army, looking ahead, this was in 1991-ish. General D'Souza was saying they would put aside a battalion in the Indian Army for these kind of environmental emergencies. Fires broke out somewhere in the Indian forests, and they did a lot of tree planting in the Himalayas. So instead of being tooled up to fight, they were tooled up to help the environment. And every country should have eco battalions, in my opinion, ready to go at a moment's notice to do things like fight forest fires, to help with flood relief, with the kind of environmental emergencies that have been going on and probably are going to be increasing in the future. And this is part of my kind of proposed grand peace plan for the planet, which is we demilitarise the planet down to the absolute basic level of, you know, self-defence, like Switzerland, say. And we divert the money that's currently being spent on weapons of war towards environmental protection, social development, education, the kind of things we need to build a peaceful and loving society in the world. And these forest fires to me are a wake-up call, you know, and to the planet as a whole. We haven't got a minute to lose. We have to immediately demilitarise. Now that means signing some kind of universal peace pact that no country will attack another country, and that we will denuclearise the planet. Let it be done. You know, I run the World Intellectual Forum here in Europe, and we're calling on political heads of state. They're all meeting off in Biarritz to, you know, prance around as if they're important, these G7 leaders. Well, Macron is quite intelligent among that lot, and realises this Brazil thing is a real crisis. That's why Macron has set up the Paris Peace Forum, which I'll be attending in November. But as for Boris Johnson and Trump, you know, they're just ridiculous. They should dress up as the jesters at meetings like that. They're the buffoons. I'm coming from a place of what is called eco-philosophy. One of the mentors I've had in my life is Henryk Skolimowski, a great philosopher from Poland who did a PhD in analytic philosophy, but he moved in the green direction in his thinking. He decided, like Sir Karl Popper at the end of his life, who also became influenced by ecological philosophy. The whole planet is like a living being. You know, this is the Gaia hypothesis of James Lovelock. You can't fix the problems of one part of the planet and then leave other problems unsolved. It's all an interlocking, you know, ecosystem. And we humans have to have humility and realise that as we're causing problems in the micro level here by, you know, adverse effects of capitalism or whatever, or totalitarian attitudes to people and so on, we're causing ripple out effects that then impact on the wider sphere of nature and the environment. So if you go back to the pre-Socratics, Parmenides and Thales and all these, Sir Karl Popper wrote an essay on Parmenides, well, a book really. He loved him. Parmenides was a brilliant thinker who was working in the Apollo tradition of Elis in the south of Italy. He was like a druid sage and influenced Plato in turn. So this is our European heritage. These people are eco-philosophers. They look on nature, physis, as divine. It's the manifestation of the work of the creator, which Plato called the demiurge. There's no evil here. There's goodness stepped in different layers and levels, like Plotinus said. And our duty as philosophers and intellectuals and human beings is to give praise to the whole system of nature and to make sure we don't damage or harm it. There's a whole hierarchy of being, which means the sacredness of being. Hieros is the Greek word for sacred, so a hierarchy is simply ordered sacredness. It's come to mean a sort of, like a ladder system of power, and it's got a bad name, but it's not at all. It means ordered sacredness. The arche is the sacred. And Alice Bailey and other spiritual teachers talked about the sacred hierarchy that run things behind the scenes on the planet. Well, I wish to God they'd get their act together and help, actually poor old humanity, who is really drowning under the feast day of ignorance that the ship of fools who've hijacked the ship of state have been running. We the saints and sages who are in incarnation on this planet need to come together, which is why I've launched this WMASC project that I've done with colleagues through the World Intellectual Forum to bring together the spiritual elders of the planet into common discourse. Alice Bailey talks about this as the manifestation of the hierarchy. Yes, one of the great pre-Socratic thinkers, Heraclitus, had a wonderful line. He said, "The hidden harmony is best." Sure, and yes, but there comes a time when that harmony has to be manifested in order to, let's say, dislocate the chaos magicians, you see, who want chaos, destruction, violence, and war. war is the ultimate achievement of chaos magic. Well, peace is the ultimate achievement of order magic, which is the alternative. And that's what I'm advocating, along with Mart, who's my line manager as a goddess, one of. So eco-philosophy is very important, and I've gone a little beyond James Lovelock, who's still stuck in a sort of semi-materialist paradigm. I talk about the goddess hypothesis. I'm working on a book on that title, which is, there's the Gaia hypothesis, but actually the goddess hypothesis includes the bigger picture, which includes our spiritual nature, our soul nature, our psyche, our transpersonal ecology, if you want. And that is in an emergency at the moment, because part of the problem is our minds have become so mature. There are so many, enlightened or nearly enlightened people on the planet, yet our political systems and our economic systems have lagged behind. They've been hijacked by nationalism and classism, capitalism or revolutionary socialism or whatever, but people that use violence to promote their narrative, as opposed to the shaman in the forest who listens to all the narratives of all the insects, all the birds, all the animals, all the trees, and hears a great symphony of truth. And the shaman just adds their own dreaming to that. My friend Professor Glenn Martin, who's president of Philosophers of Peace, I'm a vice president internationally, he talks about this need for the planetarization of conscience. He argues that we need to move to a World Parliament Association project, which he's president of as well, which I 100% support. We need an institution that can represent that planetary ethic, that universal conscience that Kant talked about. But there are different forms that can take, and so we need to have the discourse as to how to institutionalize that highest spiritual consciousness that we're capable of, in terms of a global structure. So those conversations are happening, and it's important they continue. And the environmental ethic is the fundamental reason why. And for me, it's part of what I call the manifestation of the goddess hypothesis in action, because the goddess of justice, Mart, known by other names, Kali, whatever, in India, wants justice for all the children on the planet. They're not getting it. For all the poor, they're not getting it. Nietzsche went with Dionysus because Dionysus is the god of the poor, and manifest in the radical Christ, if you want, the radical Messiah, who is a project of the collective aspirations of the Hamito-Semitic peoples, and the Indo-European peoples, who still want this collective saviour for the planet. Well, that saviour has to be a collective conscience and consciousness, which is then aroused, as Dean Radin says, great man at the Institute of Noetic Sciences. They're doing research on what is that collective consciousness. It kind of explains telepathy and what we call paranormal stuff. Well, actually, that's normal from the perspective of the saints and the siddhis. That's normal. That's what we are on this planet. So let's live up to it. Okay, so now let's come back down to 25th of August 2019. That's the kind of philosophical perspective I'm coming from. So why do I keep going on about Brexit and Bremain? Because to me it's a symbol of this choice we have to make as a planet, either for togetherness and love, symbolised by those gold stars on a blue background, or for nationalism and separatism and xenophobia and its worst, racism, where we alone are the chosen people, or our nation is the best. This all comes from a place of ego. And I'm sorry, but it won't wash. Philosophically, it has no coherence. We've tried it with Nazism and Italian fascism and all the kind of nationalisms of that 20th century era, like in Spain and Franco's experiments and so on. Why they fail and why they didn't win is because they're coming from a much lesser perspective, intellectually and morally. And so. Whereas the European Union was founded on a higher level of synthesis and intellectual achievement, and if you look at the thinkers who were behind the European Union, My favourite is Denis de Rougemont, who isn't known really, but he was a great intellectual who worked on the nature of love, one of the pioneers of love studies, which I'm working on a dictionary for. I published the only academic journal in the world on the nature of love. It seems to me love is the answer, so let's study it. Denis de Rougemont was a pioneer in the field of love studies, and bless him, and he was one of the thinkers behind the European Union, which is a project of manifest love in action, which is we have all these different European nation states, which used to be at each other's throats and trying to kill each other, recognising that they share this high unity. I believe Britain belongs in that, and that's why our statesmen and women joined up and have supported it. And I believe that if the British people have been given a fair vote and proper information, and the vote leave had not fiddled and cheated and manufactured influence falsely through largely American support and funding, then the British people, I think, would have rejected this overwhelmingly. But unfortunately, we're where we are, and the fact that the police refused to prosecute people like Dominic Cummings and the Vote Leave team, even though there's ample evidence that they not only cheated, they broke the law, literally. We're in this unbelievable, scandalous state whereby truth is, being forced underground, and lies have seized the body politic through its connivance with the Tory party and the capture of the Tory party, the Conservative Party, which ought to know better, really. It's been brainwashed by this Brexit narrative. So what have I done? Well, okay, this week I've done probably the most important thing so far. I've launched a book, which is, I'm going to share a little bit from it, which I've just published a couple of days ago, and it's called Towards a Centre for Bremain Studies and Action, CBSA, a critical review of Brexit opposition studies. Now, over the last 3 years since this referendum, I've been monitoring and reading and discoursing and thinking through the problems with Brexit, and my intuition that led me to vote to remain has been completely reinforced, and the worst possible fears about Brexit have become materialised with the collapse in the British pound and economy, and the increasing pressures for Scotland and Northern Ireland to go their own way and leave the UK. My compatriots in England don't seem to realise, some of my friends from England who voted for Brexit haven't yet woken up to the consequences. I did early because I lived in Scotland for 7 years. I've travelled all over the UK. I'm a broad-minded internationalist observer of events, not stuck in a sort of narrow-minded nationalist perspective. I see things from an international perspective. So that's the perspective I'm bringing to this book. And in this book, I've asked, I think it's 200 and, what is it in total? 200 and, let's get the exact figure, 221 kind of topics I've raised. And each of these then has a paragraph or a section or a chapter about. So the book is divided into these 221 topics, which ask, very interesting questions about Brexit, how it came about, who thought of it, who designed the question that we were asked in the 2016 referendum, why was there no safety lock put in, like a certain percentage had to win. That's always done. It's unheard of that a referendum on such a huge constitutional change would not have a safety lock put in. So who ever thought that was a good idea? Who wrote the question? Which civil servants? Under which pressure and statements? Why did Cameron allow that thing to happen? Was he completely blindsided and seized with a complete sort of ignorance attack? It looks like it, but one would have to interview him to actually get the real facts. Was he being pressured? Had he been bullied or something psychologically? I think he was. He was being bullied by the right wing of his Conservative Party. But there's nothing new in that. Those people have been shouting from the sidelines against Europe ever since, the Battle of Waterloo. They were just like rogue right-wingers. Now Cameron got power in the Conservative Party because he was strong enough to see them off. Something seems to have happened to him. So there's a question. You see, this book is not all the answers. This book is the questions. And I would very much like one day to interview Cameron, on the record or privately or whatever, and really get the truth. This book is an attempt to get the truth because it's so important. Anyway, somehow the question was that referendum was rigged in a way that was dangerous. If I'm a builder, I'm building scaffolding to paint my house or something, and it's 4 floors high. I don't build the top 3 layers if there's a dodgy connection lower down. If I'm a professional, I will double check as I go up. I've built scaffolding. I used to do that kind of work as youth, and it's incredibly important. You check the scaffolding as you're going along. It's the same with politics. Proper politicians, proper intellectual politicians who know their stuff, check every step of the way. That's why we have a legal advice system in the civil service. Another question I ask is, why did nobody in the civil service warn Cameron? Look, you're risking an awful lot unless you put that safety lock in. You are risking the breakup of the UK. You realise that, don't you? For instance, was everybody asleep on the job? It's unbelievable. And then there's another question, which is, as that bill was going through Parliament, the Enabling Act that made that referendum come into play, were there no voices raised protesting either in the Commons or in the Lords? What was happening with the Liberal Democrats, who up until recently had been in power with the Conservatives? Unfortunately, Nick Clegg wasn't re-elected, so I reckon if he'd have been in Parliament, he would have asked the right questions. He was a clever man. What happened to the other Lib Dems? Were they all asleep? I know they'd suffered a bad defeat, so-called, because of the way the press had, the press really went for the Liberals, as it does because it's in the hands of this extreme right-wing cabal that essentially are trying to take over Anglo-American intellectual space. And yet, as a historian of world history, I know that liberal tradition is incredibly important. It's what made the modern world possible. I used to teach at St Mary's School in Calne, and just down the road, Joseph Priestley discovered oxygen, and Jeremy Bentham used to go and visit. And can you imagine the kind of conversations that were going on? They were both members of the Lodge of the Nine Sisters in Paris at the time of the French Enlightenment, dedicated to the worship of the Nine Muses and using knowledge and science for the betterment of humanity, which is what Freemasonry and science and intellectual work does. So why did nobody in the Liberal Democrat Party or the Labour Party, blow the whistle, or in the moderate Conservative Party? Those are questions we have to ask. There's another question about the whole question of having a referendum at all. I mean, not only was it done in a way that was ill thought out and badly thought through, that such a huge constitutional decision should hang on such a narrow victory. Also, the problem was that what if one country in the UK decides to leave and another country doesn't? Like Scotland voted strongly to stay in the European Union. Northern Ireland did as well. Wales narrowly voted to leave, and England, narrowly. Many parts of England didn't vote to leave. So, again, that should have been in the referendum, the way it was set up, which is that there should have been not only a lock, as in total percentage points for the victorious side, to change the status quo, which is we stay, or every country in the UK should also vote to leave the European Union. Otherwise, it's totally unfair. It means that that England is going to pull Scotland and Northern Ireland, or to attempt to pull them out of the European Union. And then that leads to the